tree climber and you're doing that, I would strongly recommend that you do this. And it gets cinched on, and it's just, look at that. I mean, that is a cinch knot, comes off the carabiner and everything. It's midline, and it's a beautiful thing, and everybody needs to do it. So that was Justin. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
As tree climbers, we're constantly going up, we're coming down, and we're moving laterally. That's different than other disciplines, such as industrial access, that normally is suspended from the rope and there's always tension in their system. Or the discipline of rock climbing, where they will have a person dedicated to belay that maintains the configuration of their device and also maintains tension for that device. I was honored to be the head judge in both the Southern ISA tree climbing competition and most recently NAOM competition, the North American Open Masters competition. And there, actually in both places, I saw Justin Cantrell do a midline, I will call it a scaffold knot, and for those that want to geek out, you can stay tuned for the whole video. But he demonstrated that, and that's what this video is going to be about. So I came home from the competition and I was going to make this video, so I sewed a ring onto the end of a climbing line. And rings are great because there's no cross-loading issues, there's no orientation issues. This is about a 21-foot rope, so literally I could tie it around a 6-foot tree or huge tree or whatever. So to demonstrate, we'll put this around the tree if I can. And to tie this, and this is fairly stiff climbing line, so I'm going to take, the way I tie it is I tie up my thumb. I tie up my thumb for a lot of things, but I'll do a wrap that way, one wrap, and then I'll do a second wrap. And notice this second wrap comes up, it's crossing that first loop onto itself. Comes through, and now I'll take a bite and I'll put it through those two loops. Again, it's a pretty stiff line, so not real easy to cinch. Take that off of my little blakes I have hanging there. So this goes on, and then it gets tied, it's dressed, it's set. And then an important part that's often missed is verified. There's a form factor in the alpine butterfly, in a double overhand knot, in this scaffold knot, that makes it really easy to identify if you've tied it correctly. It's got a parallel side, and if I turn it over, it's got a cross. If it doesn't have that, it's been set or tied incorrectly. For example, if I just take this right now and I undress it a little bit and I move it around, it might still work, but that's no longer a scaffold knot or a scaffold hitch. So it's important to verify your knots. Now that may end up being a secure enough knot, but it's not the knot we wanted. And since it's cinched down, it's kind of hard to open up, so I'm gonna have to break this open. Okay, so tied, dressed, and set. That stays oriented because it's a cinching knot. So if I was going to connect this to, say, in a typical aerial rescue scenario where they have a set line, I could now send that into the spliced end of that line, and I'm ready to go up this side. Now, if it didn't have a spliced end, I could also do the same thing and tie myself another scaffold hitch, scaffold knot. Again, I'll tie, dress, and set it. It's crossed, or it's crossed, and it's parallel, it's verified. Now I'll set that, cinch it, and that's ready to go. While I'm at it, if you are really worried about your knots and I wanted to put a stopper knot on this, you could tie a double overhand stopper knot right there. And while I'm doing that, I'll show you again this form factor. It's got a cross and it has a parallel side. You can do this to bowlines and other knots too. If I wanted to maybe dress up this tail so it's not flopping around. Again, I'll tie up my thumb, and then this tail goes where my thumb was. Tied, dressed, and set. And now I have a stopper knot that's just a little cleaner. It stays out of the way. So it's a great form factor. While I'm thinking about it, alpine butterfly. Pull those through. You can vary the size of the loop. That's tied, dressed, and set. And now I'm going to verify it. And it doesn't matter, I've said this many times, it doesn't matter. This has got a parallel side. This is going to have the cross side. And if you really want to see it, just dress it up so you can make sure that you have those crossed, paralleled. Just to be weird, I can put the parallel here and I can put the cross there. It doesn't make any difference. One way of making that cinching knot with the alpine butterfly that we've talked about a few times is to put a girth hitch in there. But it starts to get to be a little bulky and it tends to want to open up when it's unloaded. So that may not be your best option. Another option is if you have a big enough tail there, you can do a clove hitch. And again, the clove hitch will be a cinching knot, but it tends to, again, be rather bulky. And unless it's set pretty hard, it'll want to open up. But there again, you have basically a cinched knot on the alpine butterfly. So I'm going to join these two ends of the rope together with a double fisherman's knot. So to tie a double fisherman's knot, I tie an overhand knot. That's an overhand knot. That's not a fisherman's knot. That's an overhand knot. And then on the other end, I'll do the same thing. Ignore that ring right there. On the other end, I'll do the same thing. Again, I'm tying an overhand, a double overhand knot. Alright, so there's a double overhand knot, and there's a double overhand knot. Those are not fisherman's knots. And when I tighten those together, it makes a double fisherman's knot, right? A double fisherman's knot is not two fisherman's knots together. A double fisherman's knot is two overhand knots put together. That's not a fisherman's knot. That's not a fisherman's knot. And I would argue it's not a scaffold knot either right now. So those make a pretty good joining ropes together type of configuration. If you wanted two ropes joined, that's pretty good configuration. The great thing about the scaffold knot is that it is a cinching knot. Now if you tied a double overhand knot and you put the tail through there, you get what looks like could be a scaffold knot, but it doesn't hold anything, right? It might look like a scaffold knot, but it won't cinch to anything. But before we throw this away, you can actually make it into something quite useful by tying another overhand knot on it. And remember, 2 overhand knots make a double fisherman's knot. In this case, it would be a double fisherman's knot that's not joining 2 ropes together, so it's not a bend, but it also looks like a scaffold knot, but it doesn't cinch, but it's very secure. Now, just for fun, again, we've pointed out that these overhand knots on the working, tied around the working part of your rope, they can be great stopper knots and a great way to consolidate the tails. But anyway, just more explanation of why I believe that should be called a scaffold knot and not a fisherman's knot. I'm going to tie my knot right there. I got distracted though. I'm trying to find that cardinal in the tree and all that kind of stuff. I can't find the cardinal in the tree and answer a question or whatever. I come back to this and I start tying my scaffold knot on the tail of my rope. And then I go and I've tied, dressed. I'm going to try to set it, right? And I set it and I go, okay, that's cinching right there. And then what happens when you start pulling on it? You find you screwed up. And my stopper knot protected me. If my stopper knot cleared my ring up there, my stopper knot would get stuck in this double overhand knot. Let's see what that looks like. I'm going to pull this through. Put my stopper knot on my climbing line. And we pull that through. And now we almost get that other thing, but that stopper knot will get stuck pulling through there, and you can go clean out your shorts and realize you made a mistake. So that's a potential error that could be potentially fatal. Now, another way to avoid that is to always pull the tail through. So you're looking at the tail right there. That might be a better option. And then you're going to tie your scaffold knot. And it obviously cinches. It obviously cinches. And there's no question about which is the tail and which is the working end. So I'm going to geek out a little bit just by talking about the Ashley Book of Knots and use that as a basic reference for many of the descriptions and comments that I'll use. So a knot can be a bend or a hitch, generally what we would see used in tree climbing. And generally right here, I would say a hitch makes a rope fast to another object. That other object can be another rope. We use friction hitches. Those hitches wrap around a climbing rope and give us a means to descend. A bend unites two ropes together, so two ropes would be tied together with a bend. The term knot itself is applied particularly to knobs, loops, and everything else. I'd say everything's a knot. So I'll basically refer to things as knots, bends, or hitches. And so this is where I really start to geek out, and it's always bothered me when it's called a fisherman's knot. Here, 24, that's a fisherman's bend, and it's shown as an anchor hitch. I mean, we start to get confusing, and I'm going to point something else out here in a minute as well. So again here, number 38, a hitch is a knot tied directly to or around an object. There are many hitches that will capsize if removed from the supporting object. And right here, many bends and hitches are termed knots, but this agrees with the broadest definition of the term, knot being the generic term covering the whole subject. While I was looking this subject over, I ran across this and I so agree with it. It's just an interesting thing. But it says, it appears to be true that a rope is weakest just outside the entrance to a knot, and this would seem to be due to the rigidity of the knot. These experiments were not carried far enough to give conclusive results, but some of the results indicated were quite different from what is generally accepted. And I have seen this almost all the time in some of my brake testing. And then just prior to that, a common statement that appears in many or most knot discussions is that a knot is weaker than the rope in which it is tied. But since a rope practically never breaks within a knot, this can hardly be correct. And it's just an interesting statement. I'll read the bottom part here too. But, I think that it's just a general statement that knots do weaken a rope. But it's not within the knot where it breaks. I just found that kind of interesting. Okay, this is where I'm really going to geek out and probably piss some people off. But every time I hear of this scaffold, what I call a scaffold knot, we'll talk more maybe poacher's knot, but scaffold knot generally has maybe 3 wraps. Poacher's knot, 2 wraps. But anyway, this is 293 right here. This entirety is 293, the English, also called the Englishman's, water, fisherman's, and angler's knot. All right, that's the whole thing. This is not a fisherman's knot, and this being a fisher, the whole thing is a fisherman's knot. And from what we've just read, it ought to be called a fisherman's bend. Here, 294 is also called a double English knot for fishing line, braided, twisted, ravel end, and everything else. Notice that it's a for fishing. It's the same as this one, but it's doubled. It doesn't mean that this part, hope you can see my pointer. It doesn't mean that this part is doubled. It means that the wraps here are doubled. So if this would become a doubled fisherman's knot, as some would refer to it, or just a fisherman's knot,
then you can't take half of it and call it a fisherman's knot. I mean, I hope you understand what I'm saying. You see where they've wrapped it twice to make it doubled? Wrapped it once, fisherman's knot, doubled fisherman's knot. This right here is not doubled anyway. You know, then you also have the barrel knot, kind of starts to look very similar, all those kind of things. But just starting to get kind of picky, I guess, and geeky on all of this. So my other the other knot that I want to talk about, and this is the one, I love this knot, but this is a stevedore knot, and it truly would be a knot. The stevedore knot is a single strand stopper knot tied in the end of a rope to prevent unreeving. So that right there is a stevedore knot. And while we're looking through the Ashley Book of Knots, this is kind of fun, but they start talking about this tree surgeon. This whole area here is occupational knots. And you'll notice right here, 480, right here, 480, these are tree surgeon's variations. You'll notice right here, looks like a bunt line. I mean, this doubled moving rope using a Blake's hitch, that system just goes to show you how far back that goes. All right, so getting back on subject, this is the knot that's closest to what we're actually tying right here. It's actually called a poacher's knot, and it's not tied around an object until the bird or whatever it is gets caught in that, and then it tightens down. It's a cinching knot. But to be technically perfectly correct, what I've been describing this whole time would be the poacher's knot. But we're not using it in that application. We're not catching birds with it. We're cinching it to a carabiner, so it just seems more appropriate that it would be called a scaffold knot. But it doesn't have 3 turns, it has the 2 turns. Anyway, that's a little bit of going geeky on the scaffold knot, and I will always call it a scaffold knot or a scaffold hitch. It's not a fisherman's, it's not a double fisherman's. There is a fisherman's that joins 2 ropes together, and cutting that in half doesn't make a scaffold knot.
Alright, that's enough about ropes, enough about knots. So speaking of tying up my thumb, I'll do the Blake's hitch. So there's 1 wrap around my thumb, there's 2 wraps around my thumb, and then I'll put either 2 or 3 around above my thumb. And then of course with the Blake's hitch, you go behind, come back up through my thumb, Flex hitch. 5-piston set. I have a spliced end on there, but what if you wanted to make an overhand knot or the stopper knot? Again, crossed and parallel. Tie another flex hitch there, or I wanted to make that self-tending on the standing part. Once again, tie a scaffold knot on there. Now, let's get that set. That would be a self-tending flex hitch.